Between the years 1980 and 2020, global energy consumption nearly doubled from about 83,000 terawatt hours to 151,000 terawatt hours. Now, many of you may be saying, well, Will, that's a large chunk of time for you to be measuring. Well, thank you, voice of popular opinion. But what you should know is that in this 40-year chunk of time, the increase in energy consumption is equal to that of the 200 years before it. Today, the energy market is the largest in the world, and it's not close. Literally everything requires energy in some capacity, whether that be our phones, this entire building, or, of course, the TV my housemates and I use to watch 3 hours of X-Files per night. Everything requires energy. This has made the term energy security one of the most important in the world, and it is defined by the International Energy Agency as the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price and the ability of the energy grid to react suddenly and promptly to changes in the supply-demand balance. Basically, what this is saying is that the energy grid is able to react quickly to shocks or sudden cutoffs. Now, as was shown by the previous year, the European Union is not nearly as energy secure as many would think, and Russia resolving to cut off their oil and natural gas supply completely by the start of next year has sent them into quite the spiral. So much of a spiral that many countries are struggling to even meet their own power demands, let alone being able to adapt to this increasingly energy-hungry world. Think about it like this. What if I were to tell you that 40% of your direct primary energy consumption was going to be cut off? You couldn't use it anymore, and there was nothing you could do about it. Because 40% is about what Russia was supplying to the European Union. So this begs the question, well, how did this devolve into a crisis so quickly? Well, let me tell you a story. Last year, Russia launched an invasion on Ukraine. Newsflash. I'm hoping my audience today is at least familiar with that part. The EU quickly responded by enacting economic sanctions on Russia, to which Russia responded by resolving to mostly cut off the EU's supply of oil and natural gas by the end of last year and completely cut it off by the start of 2024. The portion they are currently supplying sits at around 10%, down from that initial 40% that I mentioned earlier. The term for their relationship in the past was called discursive politics, which in a nutshell means both parties have an economic incentive to pull punches on one another in the international arena. The EU does not want Russia to quote-unquote punish them by spiking oil and natural gas prices, whereas Russia does not want the EU to move their energy demand elsewhere, as they are a massive market. This discursivity was put on display numerous times during Cold War politics, and most recently in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, and the EU only responded with a few economic slaps on the wrist as opposed to a real punishment. So when Russia resolved to completely cut off the EU supply of oil and natural gas, this was seen as a massive differentiation from traditional policy. Now this puts the EU in quite the situation. They have virtually no raw materials to speak of, and their largest in-house energy supplier is Norway, whose supplies amount to a little less than 20% of the total demand required. So how do they make up this difference? Don't worry, I'm getting there, trust me. But by now, you simply must be wondering what my personal connection is to this situation. Like, why on earth am I so concerned about this, given that it is half a world away from here? Now, for those of you who have watched a lot of TED Talks, not to brag, but I have, this is normally the point in the talk where the speaker introduces a grand personal story and uses that story to tie their whole topic together, and it's just all beautiful and peachy. If you're waiting for that, keep waiting. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to talk to you about why I have very little personal connection to this situation. But what I do have is a strong vested interest in global affairs, especially when it comes to energy policy and the potential for the implementation of renewables. The summer before my senior year of college started, I was offered a position with Charge EV, a rural electric cooperative-based electric vehicle charger distribution and branding company. Through this job, I have been able to see what a painfully tedious process integrating renewables into our country has become. Aspects such as a negative return on investment in the short term, or a lack of widespread access, especially in rural areas, have become huge barriers. So now you might be asking, well, Will, how does this connect back to the European energy crisis? Well, thank you again, voice of popular opinion. This connects back to the European energy crisis through the concept of crisis and opportunity. This energy crisis has not been good in any way, but I do believe it has opened up an opportunity for the EU to think about energy differently and more sustainably. Mattia De Rosa, an associate professor in energy and thermal engineering, notes that pre-invasion, the EU sourced 70% of their total energy from fossil fuels, and their renewable totals only sat at about 15%. That's where I got the information on this graph from. Now you may be wondering what the other portion is. Now the other portion would account for alternatives like nuclear or other non-renewable and fossil fuel forms of energy. This is not a great spread between the totals. We can recognize that. But if you take the 40% of oil and natural gas that Russia was supplying out of the EU's total, you have the opportunity to redistribute that. And it certainly has the potential to make the numbers much more equal, much more interesting, and it really opens up an opportunity for renewables. The EU has the opportunity here to change the energy market for good, shifting towards more of a green mindset. But as we can see here, renewables are not something that can be done overnight. We know that. But long term, they truly do have the potential to fill the entire needs of the EU and more, should they choose to seize the opportunity. So, now that I've talked about the possible opportunities associated with the European energy crisis, let me talk about the probable consequences. You had to know this one was coming. First of all, this has the potential to east-west divide the world even more. What I mean by that is that traditional Cold War-esque mentality of the United States and Europe squaring off against Russia, or in the modern age, China and sometimes India. According to the New York Times, since its initial invasion of Ukraine, Russian trade volume has increased to China, Turkey, and India by 64%, 198%, and 310% respectively. They have also decreased sales to some traditional Western powers such as the United Kingdom by 79% and the United States by 35%. Russia is seemingly moving its scope eastward. This is surprising, but by cutting off power to these Western countries, with of course a few notable exceptions, like Brazil, the Netherlands, Belgium, ones that you can see up there, they're moving eastward. And this is very important because it puts them closer to China and India. China and India are huge markets, you guys, especially today. They're some of the most profitable markets in the world. They're on the come up. They're huge, and Russia sees that. Interestingly enough, the other direct beneficiary I mentioned, Turkey, is actually a NATO country. And yet they've still been a direct beneficiary of Russia moving their scope eastward because Russia needs Turkey. They installed a pipeline back in 2019 directly into Turkey called TurkStream. And so even though they're a NATO country, they've still been a direct beneficiary. Oddly enough, energy sales were basically the one thing incentivizing the EU and Russia to cooperate with one another at least a little bit. That incentive is now gone. All of the EU's short-term energy solutions have come from either allies or members. Norway for more oil, shipping in oil and natural gas from Texas and Latin America, or sourcing new renewable energy materials from free trade nations. So the question remains, will the EU and Russia as well as that traditional East versus West, become more openly hostile toward one another now that energy sales are not encouraging discursive politics? It's a tough question. It's hard to say. But in the long term, it does not bode well for the state of global polarization or the ability of the United Nations to do literally anything, because the veto-holding members will now be even more divided than before, especially once one side eventually wins the Ukraine war. Talking long-term is wrong of me in this sense, purely because in the short term, the outlook on the EU's energy grid looks complicated at best. They were racked with energy shocks through the winter, and many countries struggled to just power their citizens' homes without having to resort to things like rationing. Last year, The Economist noted that Greece, Italy, and Spain, three of the EU's most indebted countries, were forced to spend 2 to 4% of their entire GDP just on fiscal handouts to cushion this energy shock. It has forced many EU nations to take some unpopular actions to fill the void left by Russia. For example, Germany has reopened some of its old coal mines, much to the chagrin of environmentalists, and France has continued to expand its nuclear program. Now, nuclear power is an interesting concept. You can't think you're going to get out of here without me talking about nuclear power. Nuclear power has the potential to fill the entire needs of the EU. France currently supplies about 70% of its power this way. But it comes with the risk associated with nuclear waste, which is why other nations, namely Germany, have pledged to close all of their nuclear reactors by the end of last year. Much of the nuclear infrastructure in Europe is also in desperate need of upgrades and replacements, even in France. And so nuclear power has become a more difficult and potentially even more dangerous option for the EU to execute. So I've now done 4 things today. 1, I made you hopeful about the future. Isn't that great of me? Very nice. 2, I then went back and made you concerned for the state of the world. 3, I then took that, went back, and made you hopeful about the future again. 4, what do you think I'm going to say? I'm going to say, I went back and made you concerned for the state of the world again. I'm sorry, you guys. Truly, I have put you through the emotional blender today. Let me go into some actual speculation on what I think will result from the European energy crisis. I have a surprising amount of confidence that the shift to renewables will happen, for a number of reasons. First of all, they survived the winter. That's big, you guys. The EU now has the summer months to develop their renewable technology more and expand their storage capacity. That being said, there will be more winters. Shocking. So this is not a reason by any means to write off the situation entirely. Another reason is that because of the shift to new and more efficient technology, primary energy consumption is actually going down. In fact, between the years 2005 and 2016, primary energy consumption in Europe went down by 9%, thanks to the shift to efficient technology, which in turn puts less strain on the power grid and makes it more adaptable when shocks and sudden cutoffs such as this actually happen. A third reason is that in the long term, shifting towards sustainability actually has the potential to be economically profitable. A study by Ferhat Pilavinoğlu, a Turkish economist, notes that for every 1% increase in sustainable technology, it triggers an 0.94% increase in economic expansion long term. That's a pretty solid number. And it would certainly negate some of the damage done in the short term by the lack of return on investment. The final reason I'll outline, and the one that I've been trying to hammer home for you guys this entire talk, is the fact that Europe will shift towards renewables because it really doesn't feel like they have much other option. They lack the raw materials necessary to power themselves. Norway simply does not have the capacity to power the entire EU with oil. And shipping in oil and natural gas from the Americas is radically inefficient and expensive. So in my humble opinion, the EU will seize the opportunity and shift toward green energy, thus becoming the blueprint for the rest of the world on how to do that sustainably and effectively long term. So I've outlined the issue, given my reason for vested interest in the subject, and provided you guys some actual speculation on what I think will result from the European energy crisis. What I've not done, though, is talk about why this is a topic that the average American should care about. Those of you watching me speak today are all obviously scholars of global affairs. Please. So this is just simply not for you. You can pass this on to friends, family, whoever you want. First of all, I believe this is something to care about because it's going to bring about a new way of thinking. I have made numerous speculations today, but truly the only thing I can say for certain is that the global energy market will not go back to the way it was. Learning about the European energy crisis is also a good lesson in the unpredictability of change. Every measure taken in response to this was reactive, and it is painfully obvious that EU officials let this problem get majorly out of hand without a contingency plan. You never know when change will strike in the worst ways, so think proactively. This is a mindset we all need to be taking into the future, where we have the potential to be hitting some serious make or break points for the planet, making this an issue everyone should be interested in and care about. And lastly, now that the US is shipping oil and natural gas to Europe, it definitely has the potential to raise your gas prices. I mean, come on. So there's something to care about if nothing else I said today has resonated. This is an ongoing situation, and I'm truly wishing nothing but the best for everyone involved in Europe right now. Your willingness to be educated on a topic that is not just near and dear to me, but near and dear to the world itself, is also noted and very much appreciated. Thank you.